Dexter Morgan and Red John are two characters who are almost perfectly designed to be enemies. For those of you who may not know, Dexter is a serial killer who is designed to go after high or low profiling murderers that almost always seem to get away with their crimes. So putting Dexter on the Red John case creates a really interesting situation, because Dexter could absolutely be capable of figuring out that Red John is hiding somewhere close to the investigation. But the problem is finding Red John and actually putting him on Dexter's table are two completely different things. That is why in this video I'm going to be seeing if Dexter could actually capture Red John and stop his reign of terror once and for all. Now, for the sake of this video, I am going to be treating this like an imaginary season of Dexter, with Red John serving as the main villain Dexter has to hunt down, to give you guys a little bit more of immersion. And also, let's just assume that Red John existed in Miami, but with all his resources still carried over, and Miami Metro was somehow assigned to the case. Dexter would probably become obsessed with it almost immediately, not in the same emotional way Patrick Jane did, because Dexter would not have the personal connection that Jane had, because this would be a great person for Dexter to try to get on his table, because this is someone who has killed for years, he has people working for him, and appears to know what law enforcement is doing before they do. Dexter would look at that and realize there is something fundamentally wrong with the investigation. Red John is not simply lucky all the time, somebody has to be giving him information. That is where Dexter would probably start making progress faster than most normal detectives. Dexter has spent his entire adult life working inside a police department while secretly being the Bay Harbor Butcher. Now, I think it's safe to say that he understands exactly how somebody can use law enforcement resources while hiding criminal activity. For instance, he knows when databases can be accessed, how evidence moves through a department, who sees case files, and how easily information can disappear when the right person is involved. So while everybody else might initially focus on Red John's crime scenes, Dexter would probably start focusing on the people investigating them. His main question would be pretty simple: how does Red John keep knowing these things he should not know at all? That question would eventually lead Dexter toward the same general conclusion Patrick Jane reached. Red John has people inside law enforcement, and once Dexter realizes that, the entire investigation would shift. He would stop trusting official case files completely, because now Dexter is already very comfortable working outside the rules, so he would begin running his own investigation without telling anybody, kind of like how he always does. He would first start by checking the check access logs, compare which officers were involved in different Red John cases, and start building a private list of people who repeatedly appear around important moments of the case. This is also where Dexter has a massive advantage over most detectives, and kind of Patrick Jane in this scenario that I'm about to name. He does not need enough evidence to arrest somebody, he just proves they're a murderer by himself, then serves his own justice. Patrick Jane's biggest problem throughout the Mets list was that Jane could suspect somebody completely, but without evidence there was really only so much the CBI could legally do. But then again, Jane's whole goal wasn't to put Red John behind bars, but Jane still never operated the same way Dexter does when Dexter goes after his victims. If Dexter becomes convinced that somebody is connected to Red John, he will literally follow them, break into their house, or even kidnap them if he thinks it is necessary. Dexter's investigation does not stop where a warrant could normally be required. Sure, there's the scene where Patrick Jane literally held the people he suspected at gunpoint for the 3-dotted tattoo, but his measures still aren't identical to the way Dexter finds the truth himself, and that would make him extremely dangerous to Red John's organization. The Blake Association would probably become Dexter's first major breakthrough. Dexter would eventually notice that certain law enforcement officials seem strangely connected to Red John cases, and once he follows one of them privately, he could begin discovering connections that nobody officially knows exists. The important thing here is that Dexter would not immediately understand the full scale of what he found. At first, he would probably think he discovered one corrupt officer helping Red John, and that would be it. Then that person would connect to somebody else, then somebody else, and so on and so forth, and Dexter would finally realize that he is not hunting one serial killer anymore. He is looking at an entire network, and that alone could take up the first several episodes of this imaginary season. Also, Dexter would probably make the same mistake almost everybody makes with Red John. He would underestimate how quickly Red John becomes aware of people investigating him. Now, Dexter is very good at surveillance, but Red John has survived people investigating him for years. murders. More importantly, Red John does not always watch people himself. He has followers everywhere in any line of work imaginable giving him tips. Dexter could be following one member of the Blake Association while another member is watching Dexter watch another member. He might think he is conducting this completely secret investigation while Red John already knows his name, where he works, and who he spends his time with. And once Red John starts looking into Dexter Morgan, this becomes Dexter's worst possible matchup because Dexter has secrets everywhere. Now, Red John would not need to immediately discover that Dexter is the Bay Harbor Butcher. He would start by studying him, and by studying him, he would learn that Dexter Morgan works as a blood spatter analyst for Miami Metro. And do you guys remember when the Trinity killer found out he worked for Miami and literally pulled up on him at his job? Yeah, Trinity there could have done a lot more than just have blackmailed him, but he didn't. Red John, on the other hand, would have an absolute field day with that information. Red John is extremely good at recognizing people who are hiding something. Dexter's public personality works extremely well on ordinary people because most people are not actively searching for someone who is hiding underneath something. They usually just go with the flow. But Red John, on the other hand, would be. He would notice how emotionally detached Dexter is. He would also notice how many violent people somehow disappear around him. And if Red John had access to law enforcement databases through the Blake Association, he could start digging into the Bay Harbor Butcher case, and that is where things would get dangerous. Now, of course, as we all know, Dokes was officially blamed for these murders, but the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation had plenty of strange details. Red John would not necessarily immediately conclude that Dexter was the real killer, but he would probably notice that Dexter Morgan was unusually connected to the investigation. Dokes hated Dexter, and Dexter worked inside Miami Metro. And depending on where this takes place in the Dexter timeline, there may be even more suspicious events surrounding him, like when Maria LaGuerta started up a private investigation surrounding Dexter after she found one of the slides of the BHB used in season 6, when in reality that should have never happened because the real Bay Harbor Butcher died in season 2, and Red John would start pulling on those threads. But even if we didn't even use that information from season 6, there still is a lot of strange information surrounding Dexter in the Bay Harbor Butcher cases. Meanwhile, Dexter would still be getting closer. Eventually, Dexter would probably narrow Red John down to a small group of suspects in the same way Patrick Jane eventually did. He would look at who had access to certain investigations, who is geographically capable of being present around different murders, and most importantly, who seemed protected whenever the investigation got close. And Thomas McAllister would absolutely end up on Dexter's radar. I actually think Dexter might recognize something strange about McAllister earlier than Jane originally did, because as we all know, real recognizes real, and killers recognize killers. McAllister presents himself as this fairly ordinary sheriff, which is exactly the type of person Dexter tends to pay attention to. Dexter knows that appearing boring can be one of the biggest disguises possible. He has spent years doing exactly that himself. So instead of dismissing McAllister because he seems unimpressive, Dexter might actually become more suspicious because of how carefully normal he appears. And that's one advantage Dexter has over Patrick Jane, because Patrick Jane is not a serial killer like Dexter and Red John. Dexter would probably begin by following him, and this would be one of the most interesting parts of this entire matchup, because now you have two killers secretly watching each other while pretending that nothing is happening. Dexter would follow McAllister after work, he would check where he goes, who he meets, and etc, etc. He would probably break into his house eventually, and this is where Dexter's forensic background actually becomes incredibly useful. Dexter does not need to find a giant sign that says Red John lives here. Tiny inconsistencies would be enough, like traces of blood where there should not be any, or even evidence connecting McAllister to someone Dexter already identified as part of Red John's network. By somewhere around episode 8 or 9, Dexter would probably become almost completely convinced that McAllister is Red John. But Red John would probably know Dexter is the Bay Harbor Butcher by then too, and that completely changes who actually has control. Normally, once Dexter confirms somebody fits Harry's code, the investigation is basically over, but McAllister would know that Dexter is coming, and he has spent years preparing for exactly this type of situation. Dexter would probably attempt to create a trap. Maybe he creates a fake lead suggesting that police have discovered something connected to an old Red John murder, then watches to see who reacts. Eventually, that information reaches McAllister, and now Dexter has confirmation. At this point, Dexter knows Thomas McAllister is Red John, so technically Dexter has accomplished the hardest part of this entire investigation. He has captured Red John in the sense that he figured out who he is. And under normal circumstances, I think Dexter would absolutely be capable of physically kidnapping McAllister. Now, Thomas is dangerous, but physically, Dexter should have the advantage if he gets close. The problem is, Red John would never allow the confrontation to stay physical. Because imagine this, Dexter finally getting McAllister alone. He injects him with his M99, brings him to a kill room, and Thomas wakes up wrapped in plastic. For almost anybody else, this is the moment where Dexter wins. But Thomas would probably have this huge smile on his face because he already knows what Dexter is. And instead of begging for his life like every other victim that Dexter has on his table, Red John would start talking about the Bay Harbor Butcher. And Dexter would be like, well, of course I'm the Bay Harbor Butcher, I have you on my table. But he could mention victims nobody should know Dexter was connected to. Now, Red John does not need enough evidence to convict Dexter, he only needs enough evidence to completely destroy his life. He would then bring up Dexter's family, and that is where Dexter starts losing control of the situation. Red John has repeatedly shown that he is willing to attack people surrounding someone in order to control them. Patrick Jane learned that in the worst possible way when Red John murdered his family. Red John did not simply want to beat Jane intellectually, he wanted to punish him emotionally. And once Red John understands that Dexter has people he cares about, they instantly become leveraged. And since Red John has this vast organization that is pretty large with people working in every single type of job imaginable, it's safe to say that while he's already on the table, he can have people already surveilling Dexter's loved ones. And also, depending on which version of Dexter we're using again, Red John could threaten Deborah, Rita, Harrison, Astor, Cody, or really anybody Dexter considers family. But if we simplify it and just use Harrison, who is still alive in the current Dexter timeline, then this becomes even worse for Dexter. We have already seen in Dexter Resurrection that Dexter is willing to sacrifice himself to protect his son. When Prater has a gun pointed at Harrison, Dexter pleads with him to spare Harrison and then take him instead. So if Red John threatens Harrison, Dexter is not going to casually take that risk. Because imagine Red John is already on Dexter's table, and Dexter finally has the chance to kill the man he has spent the entire season hunting. Red John could even claim that somebody is already watching Harrison as we speak. And the worst part is that Dexter would have no way of knowing whether Red John is bluffing. He could kill Red John and hope he is lying, but if he is not, his son dies because of that decision. And knowing how far Red John is willing to go, I do not think Dexter would take that chance. And this wouldn't be the first time Dexter cut loose one of his victims from his table as well. So this isn't completely out of the ordinary for Dexter as a character as well. So all in all, I think Red John survives a season of the TV show Dexter and completely dismantles him and outsmarts him. Sure, Dexter could definitely kill him. It would take a long time though, because if Patrick Jane could, Dexter could. But again, in the end, killing Red John does not mean you've won when your family and your life as you know it is completely gone.